Hey everyone, Fire here, and today I'm presenting my Herald of Thunder Autobomber guide. The Herald of Thunder Autobomber is an immensely fun map farmer that brings a high level of automation and quality of life to the table in return for its high budget and limited scalability. However, this league brought several high impact improvements to the build to the point that it's elevated the Herald of Thunder Autobomber from a fun meme build to a legitimate playstyle capable of easily doing all of the non-Uber content in the game. In my previous video, I presented a 6-minute showcase of my Autobomber. And today, I'm going to show you how to assemble it. Before we get into the guide, I'd like to go through the pros and cons with you so that you can figure out for yourself whether you think you should play this build. So the pros for this build include that you don't really have to press any buttons when you're playing it. It's an S+ tier altar farmer, it's very fast, it has a very high level of automation, it's very defensive by caster standards, it can farm all the guardians and pinnacle bosses without any troubles at all, it's all non-Uber content viable, and finally it can do all map mods. On the other hand, the cons for this build include that it's very uninteractive, often called a walking simulator. It relies on explosions for AoE DPS, and therefore it can be weak in high-level delirium. It can't scale armor or evasion for mitigation. It's very expensive, and this version of the build relies on a Mageblood in order to work. It struggles to scale its DPS into the tens of millions, and it cannot do Uber content. On the screen at the moment, I've provided a grading system for each of the different league mechanics you might encounter in the game. I'm not going to go through them individually, but feel free to just pause the video and look at this at your own leisure, but it basically shows what this build is good at doing and what this build is not good at doing. So now we're going to go through a mechanical overview of the build. I can't really show you the POB without explaining all of this stuff, since the POB won't really make sense when we look at it. The first set of core mechanics to understand about this build are the Storm Secret Rings, the Lone Messenger Keystone we're getting from a Delirium Cluster Jewel, and the Annihilating Light Staff. We're combining all of these to basically have a 12 times damage multiplier on our Herald of Thunder. This equates to having 1100% more damage. This causes a lot of self-damage, however, but this can be used in order to trigger cast when damage taken loops, and it requires constant shocking to keep Herald of Thunder active, and we're going to explain soon how we're going to achieve that. Next up is an explanation of how we basically keep all of our clear damage going. So we're running Impulse's Broken Heart on our body armor, we're using Shock Prolif from our gloves, and then we're using cast when damage taken loops, which are going to cast spells that generate shocks. So what this basically comes down to is that as we run through a map, everything's going to explode upon death, then our cast when damage taken, Crackling Lance, and Blade Vortex are going to generate a lot of shocks. The shocks are then proliferated to other mobs, and that's going to also in turn trigger Herald of Thunder to keep working. That will then cause self-damage. The self-damage will re-trigger our cast when damage taken skills, and this forms a loop that keeps going as long as there are enemies on the screen to hit. Everything on your screen is going to explode simply for being near you, and you don't have to cast any of your skills or do anything to keep it going effectively. And the last thing to point out is that shock proliferation is coming from Exarch implicit on the gloves. You can use the Storm's Gift unique gloves that come from synthesis mechanics, I believe. However, we don't really want to use that anymore since these gloves don't have life on them, and the gloves that we can make using the new Exarch implicits are a lot stronger. The first cast when damage taken loop that we're going to talk about is the Blade Vortex plus Crackling Lance loop. So for those of you who aren't aware, Herald of Thunder does not inherently generate any shocks. You need to generate shocks from some sort of external source. In the past, we've used the Storm's Gift synthesized gloves. Now these gloves generate shocks on dead enemies, which means while you're clearing in maps, you can essentially just generate free shocks from simply killing things, and that will then cause your shocks to be proliferated as another effect of the gloves, which keeps everything going. Because we're not using those gloves anymore, although we can get the shock prolif from the new implicits, we don't get the shock dead enemies effect anymore. So you either have to use Shock Nova to manually generate shocks, especially against bosses, or you can use a loop like this. So Blade Vortex is always active, and it's generating multiple shocks per second, even against a single target in a 5-second window. I believe it's generating between 7 to 8 shocks. And this is also very useful for overcoming 90% avoid elemental ailment map mods. When you're fighting a boss with this map mod active, you basically aren't able to shock the boss anymore. You have to Shock Nova several times, and maybe if you're lucky, you'll manage to shock the target a single time in a 5-second window, and that will keep your Herald of Thunder active for the next 5 seconds. Thanks to the inclusion of these skills, we don't really have to worry about that anymore, since the Blade Vortex and Crackling Lance are generating enough attempted shocks that one of them will get through and will keep your Herald of Thunder active without you having to manually cast Shock Nova in most cases. Additionally, Blade Vortex also has the utility of providing a barrier of protection around you. So there are a lot of cases where you're trying to loot things off the ground and you're reading what the altar does. During this period of time, there are no mobs on the screen and your Herald of Thunder buff falls off. You click on the altar and that summons a pack of mobs right on top of you and they will instantly attempt to attack you. By having Cast When Damage Taken Blade Vortex active, as soon as anything attempts to hit you, you're going to take the smallest amount of damage is going to trigger Blade Vortex. That's going to shock everything around you. Those shocks are then going to be proliferated, and that's going to trigger your Herald of Thunder. As soon as Herald of Thunder kills one mob, they're all going to explode and they're all going to die. Crackling Lance is included in this build for two reasons. The first one is mainly that, again, on these Avoid Elemental Ailment map mods, you may not necessarily shock the first mob that you hit in a pack. Crackling Lance will attempt to shock the entire pack all at once, and at least a few of those shocks are going to go through and will attempt to proliferate to everything else in the pack. Now, if you're only generating, say, a single shock, the attempted proliferation will fail on 9 out of 10 targets, but Crackling Lance is going to shock a few targets, and they're going to all attempt to proliferate onto the rest of the pack, which means that by the end of it, most of the pack will end up with proliferated shocks, even though they are running 90% avoidance for shock, and they will still explode and die regardless of the map mod. The other reason to run Crackling Lance is because it has a very long range. Herald of Thunder does not have a long range. It's going to only damage targets very close to you, and those targets will still proliferate shock for, I think, about 15 yards roughly, but that doesn't cover your entire screen. Crackling Lance, on the other hand, does, and it means that when you are walking up to a pack that extends to the edge of your screen, everything is going to be shocked, regardless of proliferation or not, and everything will then explode as soon as one thing dies. The next loop to talk about is Cast When Damage Taken Immortal Core with Enduring Composure. Enduring Composure is a cluster jewel notable that basically generates endurance charges whenever you're hit. Your Storm Secrets, however, are constantly hitting you as long as your Herald of Thunder is active. This means that you have pretty much permanent uptime on your 4 endurance charges, except when Immortal Core is off cooldown. Immortal Core being off cooldown will pretty much instantly trigger. That will consume your endurance charges to give you a much larger amount of damage reduction than what your endurance charges are giving you. However, because you're constantly taking damage, you will regenerate those endurance charges very quickly. Next up is one some people may not necessarily understand if they only look at the POB, so this explanation is important, and that's level 7 Cast When Damage Taken with level 9 Curses and Inspiration. So, normally you're only going to be running one curse anyway, so you may be able to run a slightly different setup in terms of your levels. However, because I'm using the Forbidden Flame and Forbidden Flesh jewels for Malediction, I'm able to run 2 curses. You might also want to run Whispers of Doom if you have the levels and the room for it, and run Enfeeble as well. But essentially, curses cost a lot of mana. So while you are constantly applying your curses through your Cast When Damage Taken loops, that is draining the hell out of your energy shield, and we need to slow that down. So we actually run a level 7 Cast When Damage Taken setup with level 9 curses. The level 9 curses allow them to be slightly more effective than at level 1, and the level 7 Cast When Damage Taken basically ensures that these curses are not triggering very often. They trigger often enough to have 100% uptime on a boss, but they won't have 100% uptime while you're clearing, and that's absolutely fine. If we just run a level 1 setup, they are triggering far too often, and it's going to drain far too much of your mana, to the point that you won't have energy shield when you're versing bosses, and that can kind of be a problem. It's very important in single target situations that you run this level 7 setup, and on top of that I also add inspiration support into the mix to further reduce their mana costs. This next set of mechanics is a little dicey, so we run Elemental Overload with lucky non-crit damage via a Mastery, and Self-Fulfilling Prophecy via Cluster Jewels. The Self-Fulfilling Prophecy gives Herald of Thunder base crit. Herald of Thunder cannot normally crit, but thanks to Self-Fulfilling Prophecy it can crit. However, we're only giving it 2% crit. We then anoint Disciple of the Forbidden in order to gain higher uptime on our 3 power charges while we're clearing maps. So the increased power charge generation is going to basically allow Herald of Thunder to crit more often. I think it bumps it up off the top of my head to 4.4%. However, we're hitting about 8 times per second with Herald of Thunder anyway, so you only need to get 1 crit per 8 seconds in order to keep Elemental Overload up. We also run Power Charge on crit support with Blade Vortex and Crackling Lance, and we're only doing that in order to help refresh our power charges, and ideally when you get to a boss you're going to already have 3 power charges active. That's going to allow BV and Crackling Lance to crit just often enough to refresh the 3 power charges while you're fighting bosses, and that should give you a good uptime on your Elemental Overload. However, sometimes you're going to get unlucky, and you're going to go for periods of even a few seconds where Elemental Overload is not active. You can fix this with Brittle Ground. Brittle Ground is now a new implicit on boots. In the version of the build I'm presenting today, we're using Sapped Ground for damage reduction. However, if you're really focused on getting higher elemental overload uptime, you can cut a lot of this stuff, such as the Disciple of the Forbidden Anointment and the Power Charge on crit support. You can fit other gems and other anoints into the build and instead run Brittle Ground, so that whenever you're facing bosses, you can basically get guaranteed 100% uptime on your elemental overload. One last thing to sort of pay attention with the way this works is that the lucky non-crit damage mastery is very important for this build. Most of your Herald of Thunder hits are not crits, which means that you're basically getting lucky damage for almost all your hits, and that's very important for lightning damage, since lightning damage has a very high roll range. So running the mastery for this is giving us roughly 30% more damage, which is, when you think about it, quite a crazy amount of additional damage to be getting from a mastery. Since we're hitting fast and not hard, we don't naturally generate high amounts of shock. However, by scaling increased effective non-damaging ailments, we can very easily reach up to about 44% shock on bosses. I know when fighting even Guardians, I'm getting to 44% shock at the moment, and this also is scaling our Impulsor explosion damage, so getting generic increased lightning damage is scaling it, but also having higher shock value is scaling the explosion damage as well. If you do want 50% shock value against bosses, you can Shock Nova for that extra 6% difference, but that's optional. You only have to do it if you want. If you would just rather not press any buttons at all, you can stick to the 44%, but either way you should be scaling the increased effective non-damaging ailments stat wherever you can. Finally, we're going to talk about unused cast when damage taken tech. This is all stuff that I had in the build during previous iterations of the build, but they didn't end up lasting into the final iteration of the build, mainly because the stuff I was farming and the level of investment I had, I felt didn't warrant it, but it's still worth talking about because some of you guys probably want this stuff in your build. Depending on what you're doing and how much you're investing, it's definitely worth talking about. First up is Cold Snap for frenzy charges for phase run uptime. You don't necessarily need high phase run uptime, to be perfectly honest, but if you did, generating additional frenzy charges via custom damage taken Cold Snap is a very easy way to do it, and before those frenzy charges get consumed, it's a little bit of extra bonus damage. Not very significant, but it's still worth noting. Purifying Flame next up is generating Consecrated Ground. This is doing pretty much nothing for you while you're clearing maps. However, on bosses, I think this does equate to basically 5% additional life regen per second, and it's going to be consistently up since it's always hitting around the boss and you're trying to run around the boss to apply your Sept or Brittle Ground. Culling Strike support for Cull is pretty big. I didn't have room for it, but I could definitely understand why you would. Now, all the crit stuff I'm including for higher elemental overload uptime can just be replaced with Culling Strike support. I think it'll come out very close in terms of your boss kill times, so maybe test around with it or see if you want to cut something else. Totally up to you. Next up is Wave of Conviction for applying Exposure. Now, I'm applying Exposure automatically with my level 5 Lightning Penetration gem. If you want to replace that, or you don't have a level 5 Awaken Lightning Pen gem, you can simply run Wave of Conviction in one of your setups in order to generate that exposure. And finally, increased duration for your Blade Vortex and Immortal Call setup. So the Blade Vortex, Crackling, Lance, Immortal Call stuff is all included in the same 5 link, and increased duration will benefit both of those spells. It's pretty good to have, but if you don't have room for it, you don't have room for it. We'll start off with Ascendancies, and we'll start off with the stuff that we're not taking. So, Shaper of Flames is a no-brainer. There's no room for Ignite in our build. We wouldn't want it no matter what, so we're just not going to include it. Shaper of Winter, I did try this via Forbidden Flesh and Forbidden Flame. I didn't really notice it, to be perfectly honest. This build is running so fast that reducing the action speed of enemies isn't very relevant. I don't feel like we're getting a lot of value out of Elementor, since the remaining 2 golems that we can fit into the build don't give us as much benefit as the first 3. And Bastion of Elements basically has reduced value for our build since we are depleting it with our Storm Secret, and it has far less uptime than what it normally would in another build. The important things for us are Shaper Storms. This is allowing all of our very low Phys damage hits from Blade Vortex to shock anyway. The Legion of the Primordial is giving us access to our 3rd golem, which is pretty high value still, so it has to be included. It also means golems are automatically resummoned when they're killed, which is very, very, very important. Mastermind of Discord, all the exposure we're inflicting is basically getting buffed. It's, you know, a whole bunch more DPS for free. No reason not to take it. And Heart of Destruction. Now, this one's really great. It's buffing your explosions while you're clearing, and then you hit a unique enemy like a boss, and then you get 30% more elemental damage for a few seconds. It's just great. There's no reason not to take it. The 4 that we're taking are absolute no-brainers, and the other options just aren't worth considering at all. I'm not going to over-explain the POB, since a lot of you guys can just launch it up and copy it for yourselves, but I will explain the important things. The first thing is the attribute cluster over here. We absolutely need this to hit our omniscience requirements. Don't think you can skip this, and You may not be paying attention since a lot of people don't typically take it in their builds. You absolutely need this. Another thing is the Energy Shield Mastery over here. You need this if you want Energy Shield against bosses. If you don't take it, it's basically the difference between having Energy Shield or not having Energy Shield. You do need it, so take it. Now, the main thing I want to explain is the Corrupted Soul, Mind Over Matter, Eldritch Battery situation. So a lot of the time in these builds, we simply just run Corrupted Soul. A lot of the time we're also going to run it down here, and then we're not going to include Mind Over Matter or Eldritch Battery. In our build, we're going to have room for a second cluster setup. There are a few reasons why we're not building our version of the build that way, however. To begin with, running Omniscience means you're not going to have any other natural strength that you're picking up from pathing around the tree. You're also not going to have the normally high amount of int that you would have doing a build like this. Now, that means you're going to be running less life than normal, and you're also going to be running a lot less ES than normal, which means you need to invest in all of the minor life nodes, and you need to also invest in both of the life ES clusters. Normally, you don't have to invest this many points into these types of stats. However, in this build, you just need to compensate a lot heavier. And in order to do that, we need to give up the second cluster. Additionally, in order to run the non-EB Mind Over Matter setup, you need to invest into mana reservation efficiency and mana regen. But these stats cost points on the tree, and it just has too high an opportunity cost, in my opinion, to afford. So this way we pick up all of that extra stuff that I talked about. We can pick up the Elemental Mastery for reduced reflected damage, which when combined with the Soul of Yugal gives us reflect immunity, and we're also able to run some life recoup and some other useful things along the tree. Another one to keep in mind is the attribute cluster. So stuff like that. We don't really have room for that second cluster setup anyway, and there are just other things we need to invest in. Additionally, the Corrupted Soul placement up here is cheap. It only costs us 4 points, and it gives us access to 2 notables for free, and you can roll them for various combinations of things that are going to be helpful for you. At the moment, all I have is 4% additional physical damage reduction, which is bringing me up to a total 40%. However, you might find a combo of additional physical damage reduction in life, or maybe life and energy shield, something like that. Feel free to just divine this to your heart's content. I didn't bother since I'm trying to save for other builds, but that's definitely something you can do if you were really interested in it. Gems are pretty self-explanatory, but I'm going to do a very short explanation of them anyway. In our main link, we're running Herald of Thunder with Energy Leech, Cruelty, Lightning Pen, Added Lightning, and Elemental Focus. Cruelty should be run as Anomalous for some extra crit chance, and all of these other gems should be awakened when possible because they all provide very powerful utilities when you upgrade them to level 5. Awakened Lightning Penetration at level 5 gives you Lightning Exposure. Awakened Added Lightning gives you +1 to level of supported Lightning skill gems, and Awakened Elemental Focus is giving you +1 to level of supported Elemental skill gems. That's +2 basically from these two, and that's very important. Energy Leech is included because you absolutely need the additional Energy Leech against bosses. If you don't have all of these forms of Energy Shield, Recharge, and Leech, and Regen, and all that, you're not going to have any Energy Shield when you're fighting bosses due to the sheer amount of Energy Shield being consumed from your cast when damage taken loops, in addition to the self-damage from Storm Secret. I've also included an Empower 4 here, but I have it turned off. Empower 4 is an upgrade over some of the other things, but if you're going to replace, for example, Awakened Lightning Penetration, make sure to put Wave of Conviction back into the build so that you have another way of applying Lightning Exposure, or maybe you want to replace Cruelty. It's up to you. I'm going to leave it in here, and you shouldn't just blindly copy me. You should do what's best for yourself. I assume if you're playing this build, you have a Mageblood, so you kind of know how to play the game, and you can figure all this out for yourself anyway. In our weapon, we're going to have a 5-link that includes Immortal Core, Cast when damage taken, Blade Vortex, Power Charge on Crit, and Crackling Lance. I explained this previously. They should be level 1. I'm not sure why they're not. We're also going to have as our 6th gem a portal. Now you can link the portal up if you get this to a 6-link. I prefer just keeping it as a 5-link and having my portal separate. I'm not dying often enough to warrant a portal in a cast when damage taken or cast on death setup. In our boots, we're just going to have our 3 golems plus Empower. Now, if you're running Anomalous Chaos Golem, you're probably not running a 2120, so having an Empower to get it up to level 22 is pretty important. At level 22, Chaos Golem gives you 5% additional physical damage reduction. This is pretty important. And the Anomalous Chaos Golem is providing you the last 20% combined with the 80% you're getting here to reach 300%. So that's all pretty useful, and that's all pretty self-explanatory. In our gloves, we're running like our utilities now, active skill gems. So Phase Run should just be on left click so that it's cast automatically as you're moving through maps. Flame Dash, we're running Flame Dash to get, over obstacles that you normally can't run over. So things like broken bridges, all that sort of stuff. And we're then also running Shock Nova as a way to manually trigger our shocks. Now, Shock Nova can be replaced with Stormbrand, and Stormbrand is probably better if you're doing boss farming, because you can place the brand down and wait for the boss to become active, and then it will start shocking. And Stormbrand is also going to continuously try to shock. The reason I prefer running Shock Nova is simply because it's a nice AoE around you that applies a little more instantaneously than what Stormbrand does, and it kind of feels better. I also believe it has the effect of increased effective shock, so it's easier to get it to the 50%, but whatever you prefer, you should do. Don't just copy me blindly, as I mentioned. And finally, in our helmet, we're running casting damage taken with Inspiration, Conductivity, and Enfeeble. The level of the gems in here is relevant. You should pay attention to them. I explained them in a previous slide. But yeah, basically, we're running a level 7 casting damage taken setup so that we don't consume as much mana, or in this case, energy shield. Now I'm going to go through the defensive overview of our build. We're running Eldritch Battery with Mind Over Matter and Corrupted Soul. This allows you to scale life as energy shield, and it allows you to utilize that energy shield as EHP and mana. Not investing in mana reservation efficiency and mana regen allows you more room to invest in other important stats, as I explained before. And this also allows you to utilize Replica Blood Sacrifice for recovery while clearing. Replica Blood Sacrifice has the penalty of not allowing you to leech or regenerate mana. It renders your mana completely useless, so having this setup basically allows us to circumvent that penalty. We're running a level 22 Chaos Golem with 300% increased Chaos Golem buff effect, and power level 3 is getting it to level 22, and that gives us a baseline 5% physical damage reduction instead of 4%. Very important to get it to level 22, because this is what all your buff effect scales it off of. We're running Anomalous Chaos Golem for 20% buff effect, we're getting 80% Golem buff effect from the tree, we're getting another 100% from our Ascendancy, and 100% from our Helm. This combines to 300% increased, and that is increasing 5 by 300% to 20% total physical damage reduction. When you combine it with your endurance charges, it gives you 36% damage reduction against physical damage, and in my case, thanks to the glorious vanity node I'm running, I'm getting 40% physical damage reduction. And that's not estimated physical damage reduction like is with the case with armor. This is actual 40% mitigated physical damage. Mageblood Flasks, very self-explanatory. You run Sapphire, Ruby, Topaz Flasks. This gives you 39% elemental damage reduction, and it gives you a load of resistances to make up for the reduced resistances that are coming from your stuff. This build utilizes a very diverse set of recovery sources, mostly out of necessity, but doing so also has the benefit of allowing us to deal with all of the map mods in the game, so no regen doesn't really affect us, less recovery rate of life and energy shield doesn't really affect us. We can do all of these maps without feeling bricked. So to start off with is our leech. We're getting life leech from our Eater Implicit on gloves, and energy shield leech from our energy leech support. This is very important for our single target, but it doesn't really work while we're clearing maps. So some of you probably haven't realized, but when you're clearing maps, your Herald of Thunder hits a pack one time, it explodes the entire pack, you don't leech off of the overkill damage, and you don't leech off of the explosion. This pretty much renders your leech useless while you're clearing. Next up, we're running 30% life recoup on the tree. I know it says plus anoint, but that was actually a mistake. I was trying out that anoint and decided against it because I preferred the crit anoint. But the 30% life recoup helps us deal with the Storm Secret self-damage. It's not super important. You can cut it from the build if you feel it's absolutely necessary, but it does also help when you are taking large hits. When you combine the 30% life recoup with your regeneration and your leech, your health bar sort of recovers pretty fast. If you go back to the start of the video, you'll see that I was tanking the frontal cone ability from the Haunted Mansion boss, and I was able to just keep sustaining my health without the use of a life flask, mainly because of I have all these different sources of life recovery. So next up is life regen via Stone Golem and Purifying Flame Consecrated Ground. Now in the POB I'm presenting, I don't have the Purifying Flame Consecrated Ground, but you might, and the Stone Golem is providing a pretty significant amount of life regen on its own. In addition to that, we're getting the Crafted Flask suffix that grants us 3% life per second. This is always active, and it's actually buffed up, I believe, to close to 6% thanks to all of the increased flask effect stuff that we have going on. You will have to unveil Cinder Swallow Urns in order to get this craft though. We're getting some energy shield regen via mastery, as I explained before, that's very important. And then our actual recovery is coming from Replica Blood Sacrifice. So Replica Blood Sacrifice gives us 1% life in ES while we're clearing a map on kill. And this is really important. This is actually our main source of recovering life and energy shield while we're clearing maps. All this other stuff is mostly for bosses, but this specifically is how we sustain while we're clearing a map. And yeah, basically, as I explained, it just allows us to deal with all of the map mods in the game. if one of these things gets bricked or reduced in some way, the others sort of kick in and allow you to make do. That doesn't mean you're at full power when you're doing a no regen map, it just means that you can clear a no regen map and still have a full bar of HP and energy shield regardless. In my POB, I'm using Forbidden Flame and Flesh in order to access Malediction, and then I'm using the +1 curse I'm getting for Enfeeble. You don't have to do this, and if you do want Enfeeble, you can always use Whispers of Doom. It's totally up to you. Don't just copy me blindly. Play the game, see how you feel with what you're running, and if you feel you really need extra stuff, maybe then add the Whispers of Doom Enfeeble in and see if that helps. If it did help and you really want it cheaper, then you can get the Malediction, but the Malediction bonus is not very significant, and the Forbidden Flame and Flesh combo, it's the highest value we can get from one of those Ascendancy jewels, but it's also not super high value the way other builds have access to certain things that are like really build enabling. If you don't need it, don't run it. It's worth something like 20 to 30x at the moment as a combo, so definitely do without it if you can. For those of you who are curious, I leveled to 94 before getting the Forbidden Flesh and Flame jewel, and then once I got this jewel, I was able to level to 95. I was running juiced up 100% Quant corrupted tier 16s, so this had like all the league mechanics in it. I was running altars and stacking altar debuffs. This is pretty much as hard as normal mapping is going to get, outside of doing like 100% deli related stuff. But yeah, I was able to level to 95 despite all this stuff. I was often fighting possessed map bosses and twinned map bosses, and this build was just dealing with every map mod, no problems. Like, I was at the point where I was just blindly corrupting everything and throwing it into the map device and not looking at my map mods. The only reason I even turned map mods on in the demonstration that you see at the beginning of the video is just so that you guys can see for yourself that the build doesn't really get bricked by this sort of stuff. But another thing also to point out is if you want the Enfeeble Curse effect, you can get some from your Exarch implicit on your helm. But keep in mind, this is only going to give you like 2 to 3% damage. Actually, I think it's 2% damage reduction against bosses, since the way Enfeeble has reduced effect against unique mobs. Physical damage taken as X is another pretty important part of our defenses, so you can get an Eater of Worlds implicit on your helm for 6% physical damage taken as Fire, Cold, or Lightning, and you can also get the Corell's Veiled prefix for 6% or 8% crafted onto your helm of, I think it's Fire. I think it's locked into being Phys damage taken as Fire. It shouldn't matter either way. You can get, I think, 16% total conversion here, but I think running just 12 is fine. It was more than fine just doing the low investment version of this, where you're using the lesser Eater of Worlds currencies and you're using the craft that costs 1 divine. And the final form of defense we're running in this build is Sapped Ground. So the Exarch implicit on boots provides 6% Sapped Ground. This means that when you run over bosses, they are dealing 6% less damage. You can replace this with Brittle Ground if you want more elemental overload uptime. I didn't, but it's totally valid if you do, and this is only really useful for bosses. There are other useful things to get on your boots, so take the other stuff if you want. You don't have to copy me. This is just what I'm running, and this felt best for the kind of content I was doing, and also the fact that I wanted to be as defensive as possible to level up, but you don't have to copy any of this stuff. This is all just how I played the character to level 95 in these juiced out corrupted maps, and yeah, it was pretty defensive, but it might have been overkill, and especially if you're not juicing as hard as I was, you may feel it's worth cutting some of this stuff. First up is the Annihilating Light Staff. This is the best insult weapon for Herald of Thunder by a mile. Nothing else comes close. Running it comes at the cost of not being able to run the Agnorod West Staff, however. The Agnorod West Staff provides max lightning res, and this helps mitigate the self-damage from Storm Secret. So if you do want to run this staff, you pretty much do need a Mageblood in order to then run an enhanced Topaz Flask, which mitigates the self-damage you're taking. Or you need to come up with some other crafty way at dealing with all the self-damage you're taking from Storm Secret. But this staff is just incredible in terms of how much damage it provides. I believe it straight up doubles the damage that an Agnorod provides. So it's absolutely crazy. If you can fit it into your build, you definitely should. Next up is Crystallized Omniscience. I'm not going to spend the remainder of this video talking about this amulet since there's a lot to talk about, but I did compare this with some mirror tier amulets from prior leagues, and they didn't come close, because although they can just barely exceed the amount of damage we're getting from Crystallized Omniscience, the extra auras provided by it more than makes up for the opportunity cost basically of running these other amulets. So yeah, you absolutely have to run Crystallized Omniscience with this setup. Next up, you have the Storm Secret Rings. These rings enable Herald of Thunder as a build. Without these rings, you are unable to generate Herald of Thunder damage at all when you're facing single targets and not killing, since Herald of Thunder normally works by killing targets rather than by shocking them. And our final uniques are the Mageblood and Impulse's Broken Heart, but you should all know how they work. I'm not really going to spend a lot of time talking about them. Now, I made this helm by just buying a Hubris Circlet base with the Chaos Golem buff effect enchant on it already. The base is really important for getting your energy shield value up, and this enchant is pretty important for giving you mitigation. After that, I hit it with some greed essences in order to hit some energy shield, some resist, and some attributes, since all these things are useful for my build. I need the resist in order to hit the cap, since I was still short. I need the int for omniscience, and then the energy shield, of course, to increase my EHP, basically, since it's doubling as, you know, a form of life. After that, I crafted Phys damage from hits taken as fire, and then I put the Eldritch Implicits on it. You can do the Eldritch Implicits in a different order if you would prefer. The ones I used were physical damage from hits taken as lightning damage. That's just the first one I hit, but you can also do fire damage or cold damage if you want. And I chose to use the Enfeeble Curse Effect one. You can use Conductivity Curse Effect or any of the other implicits that you feel that you would prefer. These gloves don't really have a lot of wiggle room. You really do want Sorcerer gloves as a base, and then you do want Shock, Prolif, and Lightning Damage Leached as life for your implicits, since you can't really get them from other sources easily, and this sort of enables your build to work with a higher quality of life. Once you have all that, you can just punch it with Greed Essences, as I have here. The suffixes on this item are terrible since I was trying to re-roll them and ran out of currency. I'll probably fix them at some point after this video, but there's no rush. These boots have a lot of room for improvement. I bought these for 1C since they had a 30% increased movement speed fracture on them. I punched it with a single Greed Essence for some max life. I hit tier 2 Hybrid Energy Shield. I also hit some attributes and resistances as suffixes. I decided to just leave it as it is and move on and save my currency for other things. The implicits have a lot of wiggle room. Now, for the Eater of Worlds implicit, I got increased cooldown recovery of travel skills. This is actually mainly for phase run, since, as you can see here, my phase run almost has 100% uptime. The buff falls off, and it's back up again after 0.2 seconds. You don't need it. You can just look through the list and determine what you want to put on here. There's nothing particularly high priority. And the same with the Sap Ground. You could run Brittle Ground if you want higher Elemental Overload uptime against bosses. Do whatever you want. There's a lot of wiggle room here. Something to keep in mind, you can't use increased effect of non-damaging ailments in order to scale the alternate ailment ground effects. So I actually thought you could, but it turns out it's just a flat 6%. There's nothing you can do to change that no matter what. But yeah, there are plenty of other useful implicits on boots. Take what you want. I think there's like a movement speed implicit as well. I think there's action speed as an implicit. So whatever you want, just take it. Don't feel too bad either way. You know, I'm just using what I felt was kind of good for me, but if something else feels better for you or you want to sink more money into your items, you can. But you've seen this build functions pretty good just as long as we have all the other stuff. And then the res, I don't think they have there's no real burden to sink a lot of money into your res, since the build works fine and can do like most of the content in the game without over-investing. At this point, you're only investing in your res for very small amounts of increased quality of life that probably won't be noticeable in 90% of cases. I'm going to wrap this video up with an Eater of Worlds skill so you can kind of see how the build does in content it wasn't designed for. But other than that, if you like this video, give me a like, comment, and subscribe, and I'm going to see you guys very shortly with some content on bows.